In our last episode, Abdülmecid stood in the gardens of Topkapi, reading aloud promises of equality, justice, and reform. The Edict of Gülhane dazzled Europe and unsettled the court. But decrees were words, and the 1840s would test what happened when words met reality. This is road to destruction, the world wars. The Tanzimat began to take form not in parades or ceremonies, but in offices. Ministries multiplied. Turbans were replaced with fezes, robes with European-style uniforms. French became the language of the educated elite, the key to advancement in a bureaucracy now modeled on Paris. To walk through the corridors of the Sublime Porte in the 1840s was to see an empire trying to reinvent itself on paper. Ledgers, codes, contracts, reports. But the reforms bit deepest where they were least welcome. In the provinces, powerful ayans, local notables who had grown rich taxing peasants and trading with Europe, saw their privileges threatened. In the provinces, resistance was sharper than in Istanbul. In Syria, Druze sheikhs and Arab notables who had grown accustomed to Egyptian rule bristled at new taxes and conscription orders from the Tanzimat state. In the Balkans, Muslim landowners in Bosnia refused to accept equal status for their Christian peasants, treating reform as an attack on their centuries-old privileges. Even in Albania, where Mahmud II had once stamped out Janissary power, new decrees sparked unrest among tribal leaders who guarded their autonomy fiercely. In the Balkans, Christian merchants welcomed equal rights, but bristled at heavier tax collection. Reform on paper was one thing. Reform in distant mountain valleys was another. Every step of reform seemed to provoke another pocket of resistance. If the provinces resisted reform, the military demanded it. Humiliated by Egypt and Nizip, needed rebuilding. European officers returned in force. Prussian officers, building on Helmuth von Moltke's earlier surveys, advised on drilling and officer training, though their proposals often clashed with Ottoman traditions. At sea, British dockyards became lifelines, supplying frigates and training officers in the new steam navy. Britain sent Admiral Sir Baldwin Wake Walker reorganized the shattered navy, introducing steam power and British methods, while the Empire poured scarce treasure into ships like the Mahmoudiye, a colossal vessel launched earlier but refitted as a showpiece of Ottoman ambition, then the largest wooden warship in the world, a floating palace of 128 guns. Yet its construction swallowed funds the treasury could not spare, and its upkeep required imported materials and expertise. The Mahmoudiya stood less as proof of independence than as a monument to Ottoman dependence on European credit and technology. The irony was plain. The Tanzimat promised Ottoman strength, but its armies and fleets were trained, supplied, and sometimes commanded by foreigners. Alongside soldiers came a new breed of European, engineers, lawyers, and teachers who shaped the empire in quieter ways. British engineers began sketching early railway lines and telegraph routes. French legal experts advised on codifying Ottoman law, laying foundations that would culminate in the Mishal decades later. Doctors and architects introduced European models of hospitals and schools. Each project was sold as progress, but each also opened new doors for foreign oversight. Every mile of track, every telegraph wire, every codified statute tied the empire more tightly to European expectations. A modern empire, but one built on borrowed blueprints and, more importantly, borrowed money. And always in the shadows stood the ambassadors. None loomed larger than Stratford Canning, Britain's man in Constantinople, the Sultan maker. Urbane, domineering, and tireless, Canning acted less like an envoy and more like a proconsul, pressing Abdülmecid to deepen reforms, to liberalize trade, to align with British policy. To the Sultan, his counsel seemed flattering, To Ottoman conservatives, it was naked interference. Metternich in Vienna watched closely, warning that too much reform could invite revolution. In Paris, Guizot sent envoys who smiled politely while quietly courting Egypt. All of this cost money the empire did not have. Wars, rebellions, and the humiliation at Nizip had already drained Mahmud's reserves. Now, every reform demanded new uniforms, schools, and salaries for an expanding bureaucracy. Into this vacuum stepped the Galata bankers of Istanbul, Greeks, Armenians, and Jews, with links to European houses like the Rothschilds. Their loans filled immediate gaps, but at crushing interest. Even before the first great foreign loan of the 1850s, some provincial taxes were already pledged directly to bankers before they were even collected. The Tanzimat promised liberation through law, but it came shackled to debt. It was the beginning of a pattern that would define the Tanzimat: debt disguised as modernization, sovereignty pawned in increments. By the late 1840s, Abdülmecid stood in a palace that glittered with European refinements, surrounded by ministers who spoke in French, advised by foreign experts who seemed indispensable. But outside those walls, suspicion deepened. Clerics denounced reforms as heresy. Provincial elites resisted conscription and taxation. To many of his subjects, the Sultan no longer looked like a caliph of Islam. He looked like a foreign prince in Ottoman robes. The Tanzimat was real: ministries, laws, uniforms, even a new navy. But it was also fragile. Each reform bought applause in Europe and resentment at home. Abdülmecid mistook one for strength, not yet seeing how every debt, every advisor, every concession bound him more tightly to foreign hands. To his subjects, every bow to Europe was not diplomacy, but betrayal, proof their sultan no longer stood with them. In our next episode, Rebellion and Reaction, Europe itself will erupt in fire. Kings fall, empires tremble, and for a moment it seems as if the Ottoman reforms may catch the same spark. But Abdülmecid will discover that when Europe burns, it is often the Ottomans who choke on the smoke. This is Road to Destruction, the World Wars.